They thought it would be the adventure of a lifetime, a boat ride to an active volcano, a quick walk to the crater. 47 people were on shore that day, families, couples, newlyweds, and then without warning, it erupted. A cloud of ash and gas swallowed the island in seconds. Some made it out and many didn't. But this isn't just a story about the volcano eruption. It's about how it happened, how stepping onto an active volcano became routine, how risk got normalized, and how one of the deadliest volcanic disasters in decades started with a walk on a well-worn path. This is the story of White Island. It was a warm summer afternoon off the coast of New Zealand's North Island. On the horizon, a jagged strip of land could be seen. White Island, or Whakaari, as it's been known to the Māori for centuries. Tour boats cut across the Bay of Plenty, and passengers were leaning on railings, chatting, taking photos, and breathing in the salt air. The island looks something from another planet. Yellow sulfur stains streaking the rock, an eggy stench in the air, and steam hissing from the earth. Some visitors had flown halfway around the world for this. Others were locals ticking off something they'd always wanted to do. They were handed hard hats, gas masks, and given a quick safety briefing. Then they stepped off the boat and onto the rim of an active volcano. Guides led small groups along marked paths towards the crater. They walked past bubbling mud and hissing vents, taking pictures as their faces lit with awe and disbelief. It was an amazing sight for first-timers, and the volcano had been restless for weeks. But on that day, with blue skies overhead and calm water all around, it felt like just another adventure. But beneath their feet, Whakaari was shifting. Whakaari sits about 48 kilometers or 30 miles off the northeastern coast of New Zealand. The island is just a tip of something far larger though. Over 70% of it lies hidden beneath the sea. What's visible is a jagged cone, 3 kilometers or about 2 miles long by 2 kilometers or 1.2 miles wide, with a simmering acid lake at the center. Whakaari is an active stratovolcano built from layers of ash, lava, and debris built over thousands of years. Steam vents or fumaroles hiss across the crater, creating gas from deep inside the volcano. For decades, Whakaari was one of the world's most accessible active volcanoes. Just a 90-minute boat ride or a 20-minute helicopter flight, and you were standing on a live volcano. But to the Maori, this wasn't a thrill ride, the island was alive. Around 800 years ago, the first Maori explorers to reach New Zealand landed at Whakatane, after a long voyage from Polynesia. The site where they came ashore is still honored today, a place steeped in legend, and the beginning of a lineage that continues to this day. The local tribe or iwi, the Ngāti Awa, are descendants of those voyagers. They've always viewed Whakaari as a place of power, sacred, volatile, and alive. In the Maori worldview, land and sea aren't scenery, they're ancestors. And with ancestry comes responsibility. Ngāti Awa consider themselves guardians of Whakaari. Stories have been passed down for generations about the volcano. No one needed to be told that it could erupt. That knowledge had always been there. But over time, the sacred became scenic. The volcano was still alive, still unpredictable, yet it also became business. Many locals, Maori and non-Maori, said that they'd quietly feared an eruption for years, believing it was only a matter of time before something went terribly wrong. Still, the island drew visitors in. Risk didn't stop the tours, it actually became part of the allure. Just offshore in the town of Whakatane, the jump-off point for every tour, the volcano had become something else entirely, a destination, an experience, a bucket list trip. Just across the water is the town of Whakatane. It's a tight-knit coastal hub of about 19,000 people, and this is where every tour to Whakaari begins. Boats launch from the harbor, helicopters lift off nearby, and it was the last stop before the crater. It's a close-knit community, practical and shaped by the sea. Nearly half the population is Māori. And the past is never far away. It lives in the stories, the landmarks, and the people who call the place home. But as Whakaari's tourism grew, so did its role in the town's economy. For some, the volcano was still a sacred being. For others, it was their livelihood. And for many, it was both. Whakaari erupted almost continuously from 1975 to 2000. It spewed ash, gas, and mud, sometimes violently, but there were no casualties. And that fact for some became an odd selling point. An active volcano that erupts often but almost never killed a tourist. By the 1990s and early 2000s, daily tours were running year-round. It was just so easy to get to the crater's edge. The risk wasn't hidden, it just became a part of the experience. Over time, danger turned into branding. Photos of smiling tourists in gas masks started popping up on social media. volcanic air, one of the tour operators promoted it as a chance to experience volcanic extremes, and people came by the thousands. Whakaari became the kind of place where risk just didn't feel like risk anymore. In 1769, Captain James Cook sailed past the steaming island and named it White Island. He never set foot on it, just marked it on the map and kept going. But European settlers would return. In the late 1800s, they began mining sulfur on the island. Crude huts were built beside active vents and people worked in toxic conditions, hauling out loads of sulfur by hand. You can pretty much guarantee that they didn't have many safety protocols back then. And then in 1914, a section of the crater wall collapsed, killing all 10 men on the island. Their bodies were never found. Mining ended shortly after, and the island was largely left alone for decades. In 1936, Auckland businessman George Buttle purchased the island, and ownership stayed within the family. They never ran tours themselves, instead they licensed access to tour operators, essentially leasing the island as an adventure destination. In 2017, Ngati Awa bought White Island Tours, the largest company running trips to Whakaari. Many of the guides and crew were Maori. For Ngati Awa, it was a chance to reclaim part of the story, to tell it their way, to blend their guardianship with tourism. But it also meant that if the island erupted, the consequences would land very close to home. Whakaari was one of the most closely watched volcanoes in the world. It was wired, tracked, and analyzed from nearly every angle. New Zealand's GNS Science had the island covered with gas monitors, thermal sensors, seismic gear, and satellite feeds. Scientists flew in regularly to collect samples and get a close-up look at the crater. But like all volcanoes, Whakaari wasn't exactly predictable. One of the tools scientists used was the volcanic alert level, a scale from 0 to 5, meant to gauge how risky things were getting. 0 means no activity. Level 1 is minor unrest, a few extra burps of gas and heat. Level 2 is where things get serious, heightened unrest. More gas, more heat, and stronger vents. Levels 3 to 5, that's when the mountain is blowing. On November 19, 2019, the alert level quietly ticked up to level 2. Sulfur dioxide was rising, a possible sign that magma was on the move. The ground trembled, and the vents ran hot. Steam thickened in the air, but none of it was unexpected. For Whakaari, this was pretty familiar territory. By December 9th, it was still sitting at level 2. Elevated, but not unprecedented. There's no eruptions and no shutdowns. Tours just kept going. GeoNet is the organization that set the alert levels, but they don't shut anything down. That's actually up to tour operators and landowners. And since Whakaari is privately owned, operators were expected to manage their own risk. Regulators like WorkSafe New Zealand oversaw the industry, but didn't micromanage daily decisions. And in New Zealand, level 2 doesn't trigger alarms. Volcanoes often sit at level 2 for weeks, even months, without erupting. If every level 2 meant closures, half the country would be off limits. And because scientists were watching and nothing had happened yet, people assumed it was safe. By mid-afternoon on December 9th, Whakaari would prove just how wrong that assumption was. December was peak season on the island. At 10:20 a.m., the tour boat Phoenix departed Whakatane for the 90-minute crossing to Whakaari. Passengers were handed life jackets for the transfer to the jetty, which is a short platform that was bolted to the rock. And then they would swap out those life jackets for gas masks and hard hats. Groups followed their guides inland, walking a marked trail of ash and gravel. The footing was a little bit sketchy. People describe it as being really loose in some places, narrow in others. They would walk in a single file past bubbling pools and hot puddles and steam vents. The smell of sulfur got stronger as they went further. The route climbed slightly through the collapsed crater wall and onto the floor of the inner crater. The usual photo stop above the acidic lake. And that was the highlight. It was the payoff, the part where people stopped to take tons of pictures and their selfies. After that, the trail looped past back the old sulfur works, the rusted frames and cracked concrete pads, and there was a few corrugated huts there too. They would take a relaxed pace back with plenty of photo stops, and most groups finished the loop in about 90 minutes. Guides briefed every group before the walk, telling them that if the volcano acted up, the plan was simple: run. Get behind a rock or terrain feature and follow your guide's lead.
They kind of just said you needed to run and hide behind a rock.
None of that concerned us. Historically, the volcano has had all its activity overnight when no one's there. It seems very a relatively safe place.
It sounded kind of dramatic, but this tour had run safely for years. The volcano had always put on a show, steam, hiss, and maybe a little rumble, but nothing more. Cameras were out, people were excited, and everything looked normal. By early afternoon, the second tour boat arrived. On the boat were 26-year-old Kelsey Waghorn, confident, seasoned guide and marine biology grad with over 500 trips to Whakaari. She knew the route like the back of her hand. And what she loved most was hearing that moment of awe when people reached the crater. That little gasp, the excitement, it made her love her job even more. Hayden Marshall Inman was a 40-year-old tour guide from Whakatane. His father had also guided on the island. Hayden was the calm one of the group, a dependable one. He was a diver, a skipper, and the guy who looked out for strangers.
Last September is probably the most nervous I've ever been.
Yeah?
It was an ash eruption when we got here.
Moon.
So we were walking into it and I could definitely feel the nerves inside me for sure.
That morning, Kelsey had showed up with an injured thumb. Hayden noticed it right away, and he teased her and made her wrap it up. She kind of just shrugged it off and made fun of him, and they kind of had this little banter. And that was just kind of the way the relationship was. Jesse Langford was 19 years old and from Sydney, Australia. He was on a holiday with his parents and sister. They'd come ashore from the Ovation of the Seas cruise ship. It was meant to be the trip of a lifetime and their first cruise together. Brian DePau was a 32-year-old Belgian helicopter pilot working for Volcanic Air. This was his first unsupervised flight to the island, and it was only a mere 4 weeks into the job. These weren't careless thrill seekers, they were professionals, families, travelers. They knew the volcano was active, but everything they saw and were told was that it was normal. Some guides had noted slight changes. Crater Lake had shifted color, steam vents hissed more than usual, but it was nothing alarming and nothing that hadn't happened before. By evening, they expected to be back on shore, swapping photos, laughing about the trip, and posting on Instagram. But less than an hour later, they'd be fighting to survive. One visitor, Jeff Hopkins, heard a few guides casually mention that the crater lake had changed color, from blue-green to milky white. Odd, but not alarming. No one seemed concerned. At 2 p.m., Jeff and his daughter finished their tour and returned to the boat, snapping a few more photos from the deck. By then, the second tour group was underway. More people were on the island, mid-hike. Cameras were out and their spirits were high. Kelsey and Hayden arrived on the island and joked about which group would go first. Hayden teased her and said, "Do you think you can keep up with me today?" And she replied saying, "Mate, I doubt you can keep up with me." And then she set off with her group first. They started hiking with their helmets on, masks kind of hanging loosely around their necks. They usually put them on when they got closer to the crater lake. And they followed the marked path over gravel and ash. The ground was soft in places and caked hard in others. Crater walls rose like the edge of another planet. They were jagged and ghostly white from years of mineral staining. Some visitors stopped to snap photos and others just took it in, the bubbling mud, the hiss of steam, and the rawness of it all. Kelsey pointed out a few landmarks, the collapsed sulfur plant, the crater rim, the acidic lake, and at 2:11 p.m. her group was heading back toward the wharf. Some of her group and others were still up near the crater lake. Kelsey was about 300 to 400 meters from the crater when someone behind her pointed and said, "Whoa, look at that." She turned and saw it. There was no warning, no tremor, just a violent, sudden explosion. A massive plume of steam, ash, and gas rocketed into the sky. People felt it before they heard it. A crushing pressure wave followed by a deafening roar. And then came the ash. It wasn't soft, it wasn't dust, it was microscopic shards of volcanic rock, sharp enough to shred lungs, skin, and eyes. It stuck to skin, it pulled at clothing, and every breath dragged it deeper. The ground vanished under a blanket of gray that hid rocks and holes. Running became a gamble. People slipped, they fell, and they burned their hands trying to get back up. Then, the eruption column collapsed, funneling pyroclastic surges of scorching ash, gas, and debris straight across the crater floor. There were 3 surges in total. They were fast, hot, and dense. There was no time to think. Just run, if you could. From Kelsey's viewpoint, at first, the eruption seemed vertical, almost contained. Some people actually still had their phones out, taking photos. Kelsey took one look and knew that this was bad. She shouted at her group to follow her. There was only one place to hide, a raised mound. They crouched behind it, hoping the surge would pass overhead. And for a moment, they felt like they might be okay. The absolute worst thing she thought would be a pyroclastic surge, something almost no one survives. And then she looked up, and it was a surge coming straight towards them, low and fast. It was the heat that hit them first, and then she heard screaming, and then she thought she was on fire. She wasn't. It was acid in the ash, searing skin. When the first wave passed, Kelsey told everyone to get up and move. Someone shouted back, "We can't, we're really hurt. We can't move." Kelsey yelled back, "So am I, get moving." And they did. Jesse's group of 21 people, including his family, had just left the crater when the volcano blew. He turned and saw the column rise, and it was terrifying, but he said weirdly beautiful at the same time. And then the ground shook, and the heat hit his face and the sky went black. A guide yelled, "Run!" and his family sprinted over the loose ash, trying to stay together in the scalding steam. Jesse knew he couldn't outrun it. He veered off for a large mound, trying to use it for cover. A rock slammed into his back, dropping him. The blast tore off his hard hat and sunglasses, so he curled up, hands over his face, and waited. When it cleared, Jesse got up and stumbled back to where his parents had been. His mother wasn't moving. His dad was struggling to breathe, and he couldn't find his sister. People were screaming all around him, and he sat down, in shock. And then the screams faded, and eventually it became silent. Jesse knew that if he stayed there, he'd die, so he started walking towards the beach. Later, he said, "I probably walked right by my sister, but I couldn't see her because she was covered in ash." Brian, the pilot, flew in with 2 German couples. During the safety briefing, he joked, "If you see me run, follow me." They hiked up toward the inner crater. Steam was puffing, ground was getting hotter underfoot, and they took the usual stops for photos, and everything seemed routine. And then came the blast. Brian turned and saw the plume rise and immediately ran, full out. The helicopter was too far away, so the only plan that made sense to him was running right into the ocean, because it was closer, and he yelled at the others to follow him. When the shockwave hit, it threw him right into the water, and then everything went dark. He held his breath underwater as long as he could, sure that that was the end. Then he saw a thin bit of light, so he surfaced, gasping. 2 of his passengers had made it to the water, but the other couple hadn't. They were still on land and alive, but badly burned. The helicopter was destroyed. Blades were twisted and it was covered in ash. More people stumbled out of the smoke, walking and crawling. Some were burned and some were unrecognizable. Brian started helping however he could. He tried rinsing ash off a woman's arm and watched her skin come off with it. After that, he used soaked towels and just held them on the wounds instead of rubbing it. He helped others until someone dragged him toward a boat and had a doctor look at him, and he flushed his eyes out with water. Hayden's group of 21 was still up near the crater lake. At 2:10 p.m., a GeoNet camera captured his group. They were calmly chatting, pointing things out, walking along the trail, but a minute later, Whakaari erupted. Back in Whakatane, Hayden's brother, Mark, noticed a plume on the horizon, and he figured it was nothing too serious, and if it was, he would have heard from Hayden. The captain of the Phoenix saw it all, the blast slamming into the sea and racing straight toward them. He shouted for everyone to get inside, and he spun the boat hard south, just gunning it, barely outrunning the wall of ash and gas behind them. But Phoenix's sister ship, anchored just offshore, had no chance. 42 people on board, they were immediately engulfed. Within minutes of the eruption, the Phoenix circled back to help and took 25 people on board. Jeff Hopkins said all we could do was try and cool those burns and reassure the victims. Other passengers poured bottles of water onto the wounded, onto their backs, their arms, and faces. Some tried to hold their hands, but they couldn't because the burns were just too severe. People were moaning, crying, whispering that they wouldn't make it. Some were going into shock. Some couldn't tolerate the wind as they headed back to the mainland. Others shivered uncontrollably. Their tongues were swollen and their throats were closing. It must have been unbelievably terrifying. And a wild part of this is that their clothes looked untouched. They weren't burnt at all. But underneath, the burns to the skin was catastrophic.
So people was quiet, very quiet. Some people was screaming. Some people was crying.
She was just like burnt like I've never seen burns before. Some were just in t-shirts and shorts, so their whole arms were burnt or their legs were burnt, and really all we could do was just try and cool them with fresh water.
Jeff said that you'd lift someone's shirt, which was in perfect condition, but under there would be terrible burns. It was like a horror scene. After everyone was picked up, one of the captains made a final sweep of the shore. Then unbelievably, a lone figure emerged from the ash, stumbling, burned horribly, but still moving. It was Jesse. He had been with Hayden's group near the crater and somehow amazingly made it back to shore. Every part of him was burned. The captain helped him aboard and they returned to the mainland. 11 search and rescue helicopters were on standby across New Zealand's North Island, close enough to reach Whakaari quickly. 2 were fitted out as flying trauma rooms, emergency care on the spot, but none were allowed to launch. The volcano was still active, the air was unstable, so they were told to stand by until it was declared safe. But around 3 o'clock, civilian pilots heard about the eruption and immediately sprang into action. When they realized there were still people on the island, Mark Law and fellow pilots Jason Hill and Tom Story lifted off, flying straight into the ash. They had no idea of what was exactly going on or the magnitude of the suffering that was unfolding on the island. From volcanic air, Tim Barrow and Graham Hopcroft also launched. None of them were cleared to go, they just went. And what they found was absolute hell. People were scattered across the crater floor and along the paths. Some were sitting, others were lying still. Many were burned beyond recognition, and some were dead. Visibility was poor and the air was thick. The ground was still unstable. As soon as they got out of the helicopters, the toxic gas hit them, suffocating them, burning their eyes and disorienting them. The pilots put on their gas masks and ran into the danger without hesitation, risking their own safety.
And I just said, just an overriding desire to just get down there quickly and help people. It wasn't until we were sort of, once we got out of the helicopter and then just started suffocating on the gas that was surrounding us and the falling ash, that it became really, really difficult and very hazardous, just really difficult to work. When I was walking around or running around trying to find people and reassure them and then bring Tom and Jace up and get them going and amongst the, looking after people and, rendering first aid. And then, during our time there, once we brought the aircraft up, there was the odd rumble, cough, and from the crater, which is probably really only, 100 metres away from us, but more. That's when we sort of had a quick couple of looks at each other thinking, well, let's just keep going and hope this thing doesn't get too gnarly.
The pilots fanned out across the crater, loading as many survivors as they could. In just under 40 minutes, they airlifted a dozen survivors off the island, which is amazing. When they returned to the mainland, they were told that they couldn't go back. The authorities decided that no more aircraft could be cleared for Whakaari. But the pilots pushed back hard. They had just pulled people out of the ash who were barely breathing, people so burned and covered that they looked dead until they moved. And they knew they hadn't searched the entire island, and there could be others hidden, unconscious, and still alive. They said they could fly back out and be back within 90 minutes, and they just might save someone's life, but they weren't allowed to return. And if anyone was still alive on Whakaari, they would die waiting. The first helicopters didn't land at a major trauma hospital. They landed at Whakatane Hospital, a small facility built to handle car crashes, fishing accidents, and the occasional farming injury. There was no burn unit and only a few ICU beds. The staff heard 2 words over the radio that changed everything: mass casualty. Waiting rooms became triage bays. Non-urgent patients were sent home. Hallways were turned into makeshift treatment areas. Doctors and nurses worked shoulder to shoulder, improvising as patients kept coming. Some flights bypassed Whakatane entirely, heading 90 kilometers or 55 miles north to Tauranga, a coastal city of 160,000. Tauranga could stabilize and ventilate patients, but it wasn't equipped for catastrophic burns. The worst cases, the ones who were barely clinging to life, needed to go even further. 200 kilometers or 124 miles away to Middlemore Hospital in Auckland, home to New Zealand's only national burn centre. In Tauranga, one surgeon said the injuries were unlike anything they'd ever seen. Full-thickness burns, airway damage, eyes swollen shut, lungs scorched from the inside out. Staff were called in from across the North Island. Elective surgeries were cancelled, ICU beds were cleared, storage rooms became patient bays, and there wasn't time to plan, just react. And the scariest part was that no one knew how many more were coming. Every minute counted. Some patients had been exposed to the eruption for seconds, others for minutes. Through that first night, the mission was clear: keep them alive until morning. So these weren't typical burns. Whakaari's eruption had released superheated ash and acid gases, causing deep tissue damage and dangerous chemical imbalances. Standard burn care wasn't enough. And one of the most horrifying parts to imagine is that the burning on the patients didn't stop. If you ever get just a tiny little burn, you know how much it hurts and how long it lingers. But they couldn't stop the burning with painkillers or with decontamination. The acid just kept working, eating through the skin, attacking nerves. Some patients described the pain as getting worse after treatment began. At Whakatane Hospital, Jesse drifted in and out of consciousness. The burns covering his body made even the slightest movement unbearable. His lungs were scorched from breathing in the superheated air. He kept asking about his family, and not always remembering that he had already asked. He was quickly prepared for air transfer to Middlemore Hospital, where burn specialists could take over. Kelsey had burns to over 45% of her body, including her face, hands, and legs. She spent 65 days in the hospital, including 10 days in intensive care in an induced coma. In the months that followed, she underwent more than a dozen surgeries, including skin grafts, and had to learn how to walk again. Brian, the helicopter pilot, refused to rest at the hospital. He had burns on his hands, arms, and legs. His eyes were injured from ash exposure, but he resisted being taken in for treatment. Doctors finally convinced him to come inside, and they flushed his eyes out and began cleaning his wounds. As soon as he was cleared to move, he was up carrying towels, fetching water, and helping others however he could. Hayden survived the initial blast, and it's believed that he went back to help the others. There was evidence of footprints that show him and another guide had walked back to help people. And that lighthearted banter that he and Kelsey had earlier about who could hike faster ended up sealing the fate of his group. Only 3 people from Hayden's group survived. Of the 47 people on Whakaari that day, 22 died. 25 survived, but survival came at a cost that no one on that island could have imagined. Major burns, surgeries, trauma, loss, none of them would ever be the same. In New Zealand, the news came through a mix of radio bulletins and frantic phone calls. Parents of guides and crew jumped in their cars and drove towards the hospitals, not knowing if their loved ones were alive or dead. By the evening, the first confirmations started coming through. Some families learned that their relatives were alive but badly injured. Others were told that they hadn't survived. But for many, the only answer was that we just don't know. The rescue had been chaotic. Some patients had been sedated or intubated before they could even identify themselves. Waiting rooms filled with families of the missing, the injured, and strangers who just came to help. People compared scraps of information, trying to piece together timelines and clues. Local volunteers arrived with sandwiches, blankets, and phone chargers. The atmosphere was surreal. There was relief in one corner, quiet sobbing in another. By the second day, the official list became clear. Names were matched up to patients, and answers finally came. And that's when the next question landed. It was impossible to ignore. Why were tours running at all on the island? 2 local guides never returned from White Island. The Maori-owned tour company opened its meeting house, a place to gather, grieve, and wait together. There was food, tea, and quiet prayers. Police shared updates. Elders held the space with calm strength. For days, the island remained off limits. The gas was unstable, the crater was still hot. Families pushed for a recovery, though, and the tribal leaders stood with them. 4 days after the eruption, they sailed towards the island at dawn. From a boat 200 meters offshore, families could feel the ash sting their faces. Some spoke quietly, sending words toward their loved ones still on the island. The private pilot, said one elder, followed the lore, the heart. There were people in danger, and they just went. Authorities had focused on risk, but the pilots remembered that taking risks can also save lives. Police eventually recovered 6 bodies. Jesse's sister Winona and tour guide Hayden were never found. Heavy rains that occurred the day after had likely carried them into the sea. Surviving Whakaari wasn't the end of the story. For many, it was the start of a lifetime of recovery. The pain wasn't just physical. Kelsey lived in a nightmare of a cycle for a long time. Surgeries, dressings, physio, repeat, again and again. She had to relearn the basics of walking and opening and closing her hands before she could even think about a normal life. At times it was crushing, but she kept going. Today, she still finds peace on the water when her body allows it. 3 years after the eruption, Jesse Langford became a nurse. He now supports other burn patients at the same hospital that saved his life. He said, "I've spent the past 3 years focusing on rebuilding myself to be stronger, completing my degree and moving on in life. Sitting around and feeling sorry for myself isn't going to get me anywhere or benefit anyone." Brian DePau has kept a pretty low profile and now lives in Canada. He shared his account of that day a few times, including on the Netflix special. Hayden's dad used to say that he didn't worry when Hayden started work on the island, that he knew his son was happiest on the water or out at the island. Later, Hayden's brother Mark put it in the plainest way possible. He said if the eruption had been a half an hour later, no one would have been on that island. Timing, that's all. Kelsey talked about how much Hayden cared for the island and the people that he took there. An iwi elder told the families that Hayden would always be there in spirit. His mana, or spirit, his honor, the essence of who he is, will always be tied to Whakaari. From shore, the island looks unchanged, but for those who know its story, it's different now. Every name on the memorial that is in town is tied to that island in the distance. A reminder of the guys who put others first, the tourists who came for an adventure, and the ones who never made it back. Police led the initial investigation, sealing off the island. WorkSafe New Zealand launched its own health and safety probe, and GeoNet provided monitoring data and alert level logs. On paper, the process was clear. GeoNet sets the alert level, tour operators decide if trips go ahead, pilots and skippers can pull out at any time. In practice, though, it was kind of murky. Whakaari had sat at alert level 1 for most of the last 5 years, with occasional bumps to level 2. Tourists still went. No one had died on the island in over a century. That false sense of security ran deep. Operators treated level 2 as business as usual, even though it meant the volcanic system was heating up. Volcanologists had warned that the kind of eruption that happened on Whakaari was nearly impossible to predict. But there was a pattern. Eruptions in 2012, 2013, and 2016 happened. By 2019, it was right on schedule. But because no one had been hurt before, the risk never felt urgent. Hydrothermal systems can build pressure silently, then blow without warning. As one expert put it, the alert levels are quite crude. 1, 2, and then eruption is 3. By then, it's already too late. Investigators were asking why were tours running, who decided it was safe, and what protection was in place. WorkSafe New Zealand found glaring gaps. There was no shelter big enough for all visitors, no gas masks even for every tourist, and no rehearsed evacuation drills. When the eruption hit, dozens were exposed with almost no protection. The conclusion was clear. The danger was known, the safeguards were inadequate, and responsibility landed on the operators and landowners. In 2020, WorkSafe filed charges against 13 parties, including tour operators, helicopter firms, and the landowners. The allegation was that they failed to ensure the safety of workers and tourists. The penalties were steep, up to $1.5 million in fines for companies and up to $300,000 for individuals. A trial started in 2023. Several operators pleaded guilty. Others fought the charges. GNS Science admitted to a lesser charge, failing to adequately communicate aviation risks to helicopter operators. In early 2020, fines were issued. The landowners were found guilty and fined, but in February of just this year, 2025, the High Court overturned that ruling, saying that the landowners didn't actively manage the tours. Legal responsibility, the court said, rested with the operators. Charges against emergency responders and logistics providers were dropped entirely. The court also ordered over $10 million in reparations to victims and families. And the judge was blunt, saying there's no way to measure the emotional harm survivors and affected families have endured. Reparation in a case like this can be no more than token recognition of that harm. He also criticized the landowner directly, saying they appear to have profited handsomely from tours to the island. The legal process was finally over. But the bigger questions about risk, adventure, and who decides what's safe were still left wide open. Some survivors also filed a civil lawsuit against Royal Caribbean. They argued that sending passengers to White Island was like playing Russian roulette. One of the most chilling pieces of evidence was footage from a tourist.
The higher the level, the more risk there is of an eruption. Level 3 is an eruption.
Oh, really?
So we're on a level 2 nearing level 3 now.
At the time, GeoNet had issued a warning. It said White Island may be entering a period where eruptive activity is more likely than normal. But passengers never saw that warning. The lawsuit claimed Royal Caribbean failed to inform them of the real risks. Just before the trial was set to begin, the night before actually, the company quietly settled. For the families involved, it was a relief. They didn't have to take the stand, and they didn't have to relive the nightmare. In the years since, New Zealand has strengthened its adventure tourism laws, requiring clearer hazard assessments, stronger oversight, and stricter regulation through WorkSafe. Whakaari remains closed. The jetty, where tourists once landed, is now weathered and empty, watched only by cameras that still monitor the island. 7 pilots were awarded New Zealand Bravery Awards for their heroic rescue efforts. Some families still make pilgrimages to the Whakatane waterfront, where victims' names are etched in stone. One survivor said, "I thought if I just kept moving, I'd live. But even now, years later, I'm still trying to get out of there." The island didn't change that day. It stayed what it always was, active, unpredictable, and unforgiving. But for everyone who stepped into it and for those who love them, everything changed. Adventure will always carry risk, but that's part of the pull. But complacency is a quiet danger. It creeps in when things start to feel routine. Risk needs respect and it needs planning. It needs leaders who remember that the worst day can start out like any other. The best way to honor those who didn't come home is to stop pretending it can't happen again. Ask harder questions and remember, safety isn't the opposite of adventure. It's what lets you keep chasing it. So if this story moved you, if you appreciate the care, research, and time that goes into making these, and it takes a lot of time, I tell ya, consider supporting the channel. I've now started a Patreon, and I've got multiple tiers with multiple perks in each tier. Check them out. You can see a lot of behind the scenes stuff. Just today I was directing the dogs to get on the couches and you can see I succeeded in the end. 3 of them arrived finally, but it took a while. I didn't realize that this YouTube thing would be me directing my dogs. I've also got the YouTube membership too. You can join that as well. Basically, it's just to help keep these stories coming, and I really appreciate the support. The links are below. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Stay safe out there.